All right, welcome to The Explainer. We're going to start things off today not with some big, complicated theory or a dense chart, but with a really quiet, everyday scene. Just picture it. A totally normal day at the post office. You know, people are collecting their pensions, mailing letters. But someone's watching. And not just casually. They're watching with a purpose, a really chilling purpose, to find the most vulnerable person in that room. And then, you see this kind gesture. A seemingly helpful young man offers to assist an elderly woman with her heavy bags. A simple act of kindness, right? But it's what opens the door. And behind that door, well, that's where a story of truly chilling calculation begins. So, who was this man? The man behind this wolf in sheep's clothing act was Kaspars Petrovs. And his case, well, it reveals a horrifyingly predictable pattern of violence. So, who exactly was Kaspars Petrovs? He was a Latvian man terrorizing the city of Riga in the early 2000s. Now, when the police finally caught up to him, they thought they had a killer responsible for 5 murders. But the truth was so much worse. Okay, so this slide here really breaks down his method, and it's deceptively simple. This wasn't just random, chaotic violence. It was a strategy, carefully executed. He'd observe, he'd build trust, and then, as soon as he was inside their homes, he'd strangle his victims and pose them as if they had just died peacefully in their sleep. And the final body count? It was just staggering. More than 20 victims, and they all fit this very specific profile. Elderly, single women, all living alone. You see, this wasn't just a series of murders. This was a hunt. Okay, so let's pull back a bit. Let's zoom out and see how this one case, as shocking as it is, fits into a much larger global story. Because the case of Kaspars Petrovs is really just one entry in a vast and deeply disturbing catalog. It's so easy to look at a case like this and just write it off as a monstrous, one-off event, right? But what happens when we start looking for similar patterns around the world? Well, our next source is this sprawling, almost overwhelming document, Wikipedia's list of serial killers by victim count. I mean, it's basically this morbid database of names, dates, and numbers from pretty much every corner of the globe. And take a look at this table. It shows that Petrovs wasn't some kind of anomaly. Not at all. Over in Russia, you had Irina Gaidamachuk. They called her Satan in a skirt, and she also murdered elderly women. Then in Mexico, a former wrestler, Juana Barraza, did the exact same thing. The details might be a little different, but that victim profile, vulnerable elderly women, it's just a tragically repeated pattern. And just to understand the horrifying scale this can reach, look at this number. That same list, it attributes a potential victim count of over 300 to a single group in Hungary, known as the Angel Makers of Nagyernyed. The data is showing us that these patterns can escalate to just unthinkable numbers. So we have this mountain of data, right? A list of tragedies. But just listing them isn't enough. We need to dig deeper. We need to understand what it all actually means. Yeah, how do we make sense of all this? Is there a way to see the forest for the trees here? To really get at the forces at play behind all these grim statistics? Well, experts, like the ones at the European Institute for Gender Equality, they argue that we have to look at this data through a very specific lens. We have to, and this is their phrase, make the gender dimension visible. And that brings us to a really key concept: femicide. Now, this isn't just about women being victims of homicide. Femicide is the intentional killing of women and girls because of their gender. It completely reframes these crimes. They're not just random acts anymore. They're the ultimate expression of misogyny and gender-based violence. Okay, so let's take that lens and apply it back to our original case. When we look at Kaspars Petrovs' victims, the pattern is it's stark. 100% were women, elderly women. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a choice rooted in their gender and how vulnerable he perceived them to be. He wasn't just killing people, he was specifically killing women. This is femicide. Catching the killer is obviously a huge step, but it's not the end of the story, not by a long shot. Now we're going to turn to what happens next and how the justice system itself can become a massive obstacle. You know, even after you get an arrest and a conviction, the question of whether real justice has been served, that lingers. And when the crimes fit a clear pattern like femicide, that question becomes even more critical because the answer is often really complicated by systematic inefficiency. Just take a look at this. On one side, you've got the ideal, right? What the justice system should be, efficient, swift, focused on meaningful evidence. But on the other side, well, that's the reality. And this is described in a public report from Latvia's own Supreme Court around the time of the Petrovs case. They're talking about inefficient reviews, huge case files just packed with useless information, and a tremendous waste of time and resources. And this quote from that report, it's absolutely damning. Often the documents in such case files are there for no other reason than decoration. Wow. I mean, when a country's highest court says its legal files are filled with fluff, it tells you that the system can get so bogged down in its own bureaucracy that it actually hides the very patterns it should be identifying. So, after this whole journey, from one single case to the global stage, what if we actually revealed? What's the final takeaway here? Well, we've seen that these horrific crimes are rarely random. They follow these predictable patterns where vulnerable groups, and very often women, are specifically targeted. We've learned that by applying a gender lens, we can see this pattern for what it is, femicide. And finally, we've seen that the path to justice for these victims can be blocked by systemic failures that don't see the very patterns we've just uncovered today. And all of this leaves us with one final crucial question. The data is right there. The patterns of who gets targeted are crystal clear. The systemic problems are documented. So, if we can see the problems so clearly in the data, why is delivering swift, effective, and meaningful justice so profoundly difficult?